So in this video we're going to continue with solving quadratic equations, but this time we're going to be using a formula, and you've heard me refer to this before as the minus b formula. So let's just do a quick recap of some of the kind of quadratic equations that we were solving yesterday. So let's say I have an equation x squared plus 8x plus 5 equals 0. Now that equation is very similar to the ones we were doing yesterday, and if you remember, the question was to solve the quadratic equation. And when they say solve, we want to have an answer x equals question mark. But what we found out yesterday was that we actually always have two answers for quadratic equations. So we could have x equals question mark and x equals question mark 2. So we should always expect two answers. So in this example, it's a quadratic trinomial. So if you remember how we solved that, we did our brackets and our brackets with our x here equals 0. And then what we did was we got the factors of 5. Factors of 5. In this case, 5 is a prime number, so our factors are just going to be 5 times 1. And then what we had to do is we had to pick whichever combination of this adds up to give us the coefficient of x and put them here and here. Now, looking at this, hopefully you'll see that there's no actual answer, because plus 5 and plus 1 will not add up to give me 8x. So that means that this is wrong. So what's different with this question? Why can't we solve it? Well, the reason is that our answers aren't actually whole numbers. Our answers are going to be decimals. It might be 4.6 times 2.3. Factors that actually we couldn't figure out in our head like we can with these ones. So for these type of questions, we're going to use a different method. We're going to use a formula, and we're going to use what's known as the minus b formula. So if we look at it again, our equation is x squared plus 8x plus 5 equals 0. Now we know already that this is called a quadratic trinomial. And trinomial because it has three parts, quadratic because it's a quadratic equation, it has this to the power of 2. And all quadratic trinomials are in the form ax squared plus bx plus c. So the first thing you do when you approach these questions using the formula is you look at the normal format for a quadratic trinomial, which is this, and you compare it to the equation you're given in the question. And you identify what's a, what's b, and what's c. So you just need to remember that a is always the number in front of the x squared. So in this case, there's no number in front of the x squared, so you could put a 1 there, so a equals 1. The number in front of the x is always the b, so in this case b equals 8. And the constant on its own is always the c, so in this case it's 5. Now one thing that's really important, and you don't have to worry about it in this question, is you have to write down whether it's a plus number or a negative number. Is this a plus 5 or a negative 5? So don't forget to do that, because that will affect some other questions. So what do you do next? Well, then you go to your log tables, and in your log tables, I can't remember the page right now, there's a formula, the minus b formula, but I advise that you learn it. And the minus b formula is x equals minus b plus or minus, I'll explain what that means in a minute, but that's how we say it, plus or minus b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. And remember, make sure you're taking notes during this, so you want to write down that equation because you're going to be using it a lot over the next couple of lessons. So now all we do is we use this formula and we use our values of a, b and c, plug in the values and see what we get for x. What some people suggest doing is you solve this bit on its own first. So just so I know what goes in the brackets here, because it's a lot to type into your calculator otherwise, I'm going to just figure out what b squared minus 4ac is first. So in our case b is 8, so that would be 8 squared, minus 4 times a is 1, times c is 5. So that would be 64 minus 20, 44. Now let's plug in the rest of our values into our full equation. So we have x equals minus b. Now remember, don't forget the minus b, or the minus, that's minus plus 8, which is just minus 8, plus or minus square root of, we've already figured out what this bit is at the side here already, 44, all over 2 times a, and a was 1, so that's 2 times 1. Now this is where the plus or minus bit comes into. If you remember, for the other questions we always had two answers, and this is why we use this plus or minus. What we actually do now is we have two equations. It's two equations written in one really. We have x can equal minus 8 plus square root 44 over 2, or, because we have two answers, x, oh, forgot the equals over there, equals minus 8 minus square root 44 over 2. Now, depending on what way they ask you to leave your answer, they might say, let's say they say in this question your answer has to be to 2 decimal places. We then type this into our calculator. So minus 8 plus square root 44 equals divided by 2. And for the first answer, we get an answer of x equals minus 0.68. And for the second answer, we get x equals minus 7.316. To 2 decimal places then, that's going to become minus 7.32. So these are your two answers for the question. So I'm going to give you a couple of questions to practice now. Oh, sorry, that box isn't very good. I'll give you a couple of questions to practice, and then I'll put another example up in another video.